Hello and welcome to Quines Cast, Scotland's feminist arts podcast. I am Hannah Lavery.
And I am Caitlin Skinner, and welcome to our special bonus episode for Quines Cast Season 1.
We are joined by some of the incredible women who you'll have heard throughout our series. We've invited them to come along for a roundtable discussion to dig in a little deeper into some of the themes and ideas that came out of the writing they shared as part of the podcast.
And we have with us today from our City episode, Denise Mina, author. From Wild, poet Victoria McNulty. From Change, writer Kirstin, and from Success, journalist and author Arusa Qureshi. Hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for being here.
Before we get stuck into the discussion, I wanted to say a big thank you to everyone who listened to Season 1. We've had a great response so far, and some things people have said. Inspiring, warm, funny and uplifting in its wonderfully diverse exploration of the theme of city. Loved it, Sarah Jane.
And from Rona, who said, absolutely what we need now and always.
And from Kay, we had an hour of wilderness and righteous anger, rebellion and affirmation of gannets and loss and dodgy feet and wine that tastes funny. Highly recommend it.
Thank you everyone who listened, who passed it on to other people and who messaged in to tell us how much you enjoyed it. Thank you so much. The full series is still available, so please do share with anyone you think might like to listen.
In this episode, we'll be referencing some of the ideas from previous episodes, but don't worry, you don't need to have listened to the whole thing to follow along. Just sit back and enjoy the conversation.
So to kickstart our discussion today, we've invited each of our guests to come up with a question inspired by the piece of work they wrote for Quines Cast. And we will put that question to the rest of our distinguished panel. For our first episode was on the theme of city, and Denise, you kicked us off with a wonderful piece of writing, which I'm still thinking about a solo trip to New York. Your quest to be the subject of your own story, to see and not to be seen. What I'd love to know is, why do you think being alone in a city is a significant thing for a woman?
I think travelling solo, I see the city as a place of liberation for women. The feminist movement didn't really kick off until we had solidarity. For me, the city is solidarity with other women. And so during lockdown, I was thinking about that a lot, because I was thinking about all those women who were isolated, sometimes with their abusers, sometimes in unhappy situations. And it just made me really appreciate the solidarity of that kind of communal space. And it was when women came into cities during industrialisation, which we always talk about as really bad, but that was when women started to work and get independent money and started to be seen. And so the city for me is a very precious place, and it feels like a very safe place, and it feels like a liberation.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, absolutely. I think that really came across in the story that you shared, the time I forgot I was a woman. Okay, so have you brought a question to start our discussion today on that theme then?
Yes. Now, I don't really know what these questions are supposed to be like, so it's very subjective and experiential of each of the people here. Does the city feel like a place of safety for you?
It's a good one.
I'm a bit terrified I'm going to crush it right away, actually, because it doesn't feel like a particular place of safety for me. I'm from Glasgow. I've lived in Glasgow my whole life. I grew up in a scheme in the East End of Glasgow that was notorious for all the wrong reasons and pretty badly represented in a lot of times as well. So, and then when I was younger, I was working in pubs and things like that as well. I was going to football matches and stuff, and there was always a level of danger to me about being a woman in that community, in that city, and that's to do with class, it's to do with gender, and maybe it's perceived threat as well as much as what's actually existing, I don't know. But no, as I get older and maybe my social capital's held elsewhere than maybe it was when I was a younger woman, I feel a wee bit more invisible, and I'm finally getting to feel a wee bit safer here because I can go about and do what I like to do. But no, I can't say I have an experience where I can say, cities are safe places for women.
I totally agree with you that I think cities generally don't feel like safe spaces for women. But what you said, Denise, really resonated about the kind of safety element. I'm from Edinburgh and I was born in Edinburgh and I've lived there my whole life. And I think Edinburgh feels safe to me because it's a familiar place and I've never lived anywhere else. So that is like my safe space. And even though the city itself doesn't always feel safe when you're out and about in certain certain spaces. To me personally, it's just that familiarity. But I've been thinking about this a lot, actually, because I turned 30 this year and I haven't really travelled that much, and especially haven't travelled solo. And thinking about going to other cities and whether I would feel safe, I don't know if I necessarily would by myself. So in that case, I totally agree with what Victoria's saying, that cities in general don't feel like safe spaces for women, especially solo women, even if my home feels safe because it's familiar.
Well, I don't live in a city anymore. And having lived in cities in Edinburgh and Glasgow and Aberdeen until I was 35, and now I live in a village. And the community that you were talking about is actually the first time that I've experienced it. I'd lived in tenement flats my whole life and not known the names of the people upstairs and downstairs necessarily, because I was moving on every few months or 6 months, or they were. And this was, it's taken sort of 8 years of living out of a city for me to find that community amongst women within the area that you live in, rather than one that you create yourself through work or friendships. And no, coming back now, when I come back to the city, I do not feel safe anymore. I mean, most of the time, if I'm coming into Glasgow of an evening at a weekend and I have to try and brave in the taxi rank back, I had a book out in 2021, and for the book launch I was trying to get a taxi back to my village because I'd missed the last train, and I got incredibly frightened with this, with just people around. But I wonder if that's just my horizons have got a wee bit smaller now, because when I was 20 I spent a summer living and working in Berlin in a kebab shop and selling hats at Love Parade. I didn't feel the terror then as a 20-year-old that I do now as a 42-year-old in a city. So maybe that's just me kind of hunkering down a wee bit more.
I thought one of the interesting things that came up in the podcast was the idea of cities being offering a sort of intersectional space. And I wondered about, when we talk about safety as well as like physical safety, is that safety of being able to be yourself? And I wondered if that was also kind of what you were asking within that question as well.
Well, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to it. Do you know what I mean? I mean, I think the responses are so interesting. I read this book called Fat, which is about the notion of fat. And one of the things was, they were all like academic essays, and one of the things was this Swedish psychologist who spent time with girls in Sweden in a school, and she talked about the way girls talked about their bodies. So the girls would say, I'm really fat, and other girls would say, you're not fat. And then an actual fat girl, which I was at school, turned up. This resonated so strongly. And she said, I'm fat. And they were all furious with her because she was not allowed to engage in that discourse. And then she said, and she's fat as well. And then she got shunned from the group. And it was just like all the different ways. But what the psychologist said was, one of the problems with the feminist movement is that we are so used to problematizing the nature of femininity that we can only talk about the negatives, and it makes us all exhausted. Do you know what I mean? For me, I came to Glasgow from South London. I mean, I grew up in Berlanark. Do you know what I mean? I was from East Kilbride. But we moved away, and I came back and I found the women's library in the city. And I found other women who didn't fit in anywhere in the city. And if you move around a lot when you're young, you need to come to the city to meet other people who've had that experience. Otherwise, all you ever get is you don't fit in this group. That's all you get. And I think that's a very common experience. You really have to come to the city to meet other weirdos. Do you know what I mean? Absolutely. And you find out, like Berlin, you find out where the weirdos in your group are going, and you all go to those. I've just finished writing something about Savonarola, and I don't know if you know this, but Florence was the San Francisco of the Middle Ages. It was where all the gay men went, basically to meet each other. There was a pub on one side of the Arno River called The Hole. I don't know if you can keep that in. But I was just quite thrilled reading that, and I was thinking, there is something about us all being here and being interested in these abstract questions of, without an answer. There isn't a right or wrong answer to it, but there is the fact that we are all in the same space asking unanswerable questions. For me, is a feature of the city. And that's something that I've found in the city.
That dichotomy that you've highlighted there in the city around having both solidarity and massive people finding your community and also danger and being exposed, and like that reminds me of the kind of the thing we're having with social media right at the moment, is both those a really dangerous place for women and a massive place of solidarity for the movement. And yeah, that just rang really true for me about that exact same problem about big groups of people in one place, right? Exposing and galvanising. What do you think we need for women to have greater ownership of the city, to feel safer, to have a say? Yeah.
Imagine that. Imagine if all the men had to stay in after 8 o'clock. Imagine that, seriously. Imagine if men weren't allowed in a fucking taxi queue. But imagine that, do you know what I mean? I mean, actually think about that. If it is a gender-based problem, think about if all the men had to stay home and had to get chaperoned to make sure they didn't get into trouble. Armed uprising now! Lady army around.
Well, I definitely think there's something about when you were talking about taxis. Like, you know, did you want to, but like having public transport, like being able to actually get home safely.
Well, the situation was as well that I was being really bothered by the man beside me. So I asked the man ahead of me if he wouldn't mind letting me skip the queue, and he joined in with the man on the other side. And it was just like I was getting really kind of, from both sides, completely unknown. And it seems a bit silly though that I'm pitting that against 35 years of lived experience as my main issue with being in a city. I suppose it's just because I've just come from the Glasgow Central taxi rank today, so I'm thinking about it.
Is age an issue? Because you were saying that you feel safer as you get older because you feel more invisible.
Yeah, I connected a lot with what you were saying about how we tie all our problems to our femininity, and we kind of. But I do think that perhaps if I think about times where I've not felt safe or I've not been safe, it has been because of my gender, the moving about, if I'm honest. And there's something about when you hit a certain age and you're no longer deemed fuckable, you're all of a sudden entitled to a space at the bar, a space in the crowd. And there's something nice in that, as well as also being like, well, what's wrong with me now because I'm over 25?
No. You can still get your hole, though. Do you know what I mean? And you haven't reached your sexual peak, which is in your 40s.
And it's quite nice to know that while also being invisible, I feel. But that I do think age is a thing.
Who had if I get attacked method? I always had my keys in my fingers. Keys in the fingers.
Mm-hmm. But you're taught it from, I mean, it's kind of, it's bred into us from when we first start going out. I mean, 12, 13 or something, keys in the fingers anytime you were by yourself. 12 and 13 is a bit young for that. I'm thinking maybe it was probably 14, 15, but still, you put your keys, and it's one of the things that I can't remember if it was my mum taught me to be that wary and that frightened, or it was just other other girls handing the methods of survival down. So we got the methods of survival, but within that as well, you're taking on that lesson and you're taking on the necessary fright for the flight or fight response.
It's so weird that we're all taught different versions of this same kind of thing from a very young age, whatever city or place you live in. But just listening to all of you talk, Denise, you said something about how cities are places for weirdos, which really resonates with me because I've always felt that with places like Berlin. I love Berlin and other cities like that. But very weirdly, like I said, I'm from Edinburgh and I've lived there my whole life. The safest I probably feel in Edinburgh is during August in the Fringe, which shouldn't be the way it is because it's the busiest period. It's when it's so busy and it's, by nature dangerous. But I feel safest because it's when lots of other people of colour in particular come to Edinburgh, and it's when I feel like, I'm not the only one, and I feel a different sense of safety in August in Edinburgh. And I wondered if anyone else kind of recognise that as well, just being in different spaces like cities where you find your tribe and you're like, I feel safe.
But for those of us without a tribe, do you know what I mean? When you go somewhere that doesn't have that kind of monolithic identity, do you know, it's just thrilling because you're just kind of like, these are all the tribeless people. Like you go to Berlin or you go to New York or you go to, do you know what I mean? All those different places that you can go where it's kind of like you don't have to fit in. You don't have to have gone to this particular school. You don't have to know everybody. You could just rock up and be yourself. Do you know what I mean? You don't have to situate yourself all the fucking time. Do you know what I mean?
I think I've been craving that actually recently as I'm kind of getting older, and like I said, I haven't travelled much in my life, so I've really been craving going to places like that where I can feel like, okay, everyone's kind of in the same boat, and maybe that's what I need to do this year.
It feels like this is a really good moment to move on to wildness, because it feels like we're talking about wanting to be wild. So we had Victoria is here from the Wild episode. Your poetry that you shared with us sort of explored those things, but like in the ways in which women are denied, I think, and shamed and stripped of their sort of wild and authentic selves. And then wildness is in part for you that rage, that inherited rage, or the rage in response to those women that have come before. And I wonder if you could maybe talk to us a little bit about, I suppose, what it is to be an artist, a female artist, a poet who expresses that rage in their work, that uses rage like in your work. And is it still shameful and dangerous to be the angry woman and to be the angry female artist? How is that received?
I think it depends who's receiving it, if I'm honest. I think it still can be quite dangerous depending on what you're raging against. I've certainly came up against not even just kind of kickback, but actual blanket, you'll not be saying that tonight, or you'll not be performing that. But at the same time, I've performed in spaces where they've been really welcome to hearing that perspective. I don't really know why that is. I don't know if it's sometimes the subject matter. It's still stuff that, if you're talking about gender or class or sectarianism in Scotland, that it still subconsciously rubs people the wrong way. Or if it's just, people have to justify their choices to funders and producers, and they're just a wee bit like, please don't do your class war poem today, thank you. Do you know what I mean? I don't know, because for all it might be a dangerous space to be professionally, if you see it professionally, I can't imagine making art without it. Everything that I make comes from that knot in my stomach. I sometimes wish I couldn't. I wish I could write tenderly or even be funny. Sometimes I would like to just be one of the funny poets, but it's just no me. I certainly feel it. I feel it all the time where you're weighing up these things of, can I say that? Should I say that? Is that going to come back on me? How will it reflect on me? But how much I care about it, I'm not sure.
It definitely feels like there's something really I love your work so much, and I love your performances so much. And I just think there's something really powerful about seeing a woman who embraces that rage and anger and not ashamed of it. It feels like there's a lot more ability for a man to do that and I think I was just really interested in you as an artist.
So I got into poetry when I was slightly older. I was in my late 20s. I was a mum. I started as a hobby, and then it kind of just sort of spiralled, and it was my place where I could say what I meant. It wasn't the school ground, it wasn't my other parents, it wasn't in my mum's house. Maybe that's why I gave less of a fuck, because that meant so much to have that. Whereas if I'd started out, like maybe left school and decided I was going to be a writer and started on that path young and then kind of aimed to that, I would have been more measured in that rage, because that's probably the sensible thing to do. But no, that was why I'd done it, because I thought I can lance this, boil the night. This is my thing.
Oh, wow. If you haven't heard the episode, I really encourage you to do that, because Victoria's performance and her poetry is just incredible. But I wanted to turn to you, Victoria, to see the question you might have for the rest of us to talk about.
Yeah, I think when I listened to everybody else's stuff back, actually I realised that we were all talking about the same thing in a different way. We were all talking about how we claim our authentic self in the space we're in, whether it's politically or, in an urban setting or whatever. And I just wondered, without the obvious answers, where does that come from? How can so many people be asked to do a different assignment and say the same stuff?
Well, I was thinking when I listened to everybody's, I was really struck as well by the similar themes, how a lot of people were discussing a kind of a family history, that when we were kind of called on to think about ourselves and write as women, we were locating ourselves in a kind of a genealogy. So you'd mentioned your grandma and your granddad, and there was the amazing poems that you did, and Marjorie's as well, about her female relatives coming, crossing over. But there was just that kind of idea where all of us were kind of considering other women around us in some way in order to write that piece. I found it quite difficult. I like writing fiction. I don't like writing stuff that directly relates to me. And I really found it quite difficult to be putting big chunks of actual first person me out there and especially performing it. But I did find it really interesting that all of us, everybody kind of situated themselves within not necessarily a community, but a network of other women in some way, in order to discuss their own experience.
What an interesting question. Do you know, I think the way we speak about ourselves as women is so formed by, I don't know, an imagined mum or something. I don't know. I think the good woman is always looking after other people. And that for me is so profound. And I think it's crippling and also to be lauded. We situate ourselves amongst other women as a way of saying, please don't kill me for being weird and angry and having a career and kids and also, you know, enjoying my physicality, all the stuff that you're not supposed to do. I don't know, but I think that situatedness, I think there is a thing about good women are performatively looking after other people all the time. And I think it's very difficult for women, because I think that's one of the commonalities, is that we all put ourselves in a group or in a lineage. One of the things that's very, very difficult for women to do, and actually was touched upon in Success a wee bit, is just to say, I'm going to fucking do this. Even if people feel very uncomfortable about me doing something very successful and appearing to be a bit of a notice box and stand out from the crowd, the only way you can actually justify that is to say, other girls are coming behind me. That's in my head. I'm not saying to other people, but the only way I can fucking justify being a writer, because that's, in my family, having a job for a woman is massive. Making money as a woman, having opinions and being successful is mortifying. And you need to be fucking sweary and, do you know, a difficult person to say, I'm writing 15 fucking novels, fuck you. Do you know what I mean? No, I'm not going to do one and then shut up and then disappear into having 17 children. I'm not doing that. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But I think situating yourself in a lineage and in a group is a way of asking people to forgive you. I'm not in the tribe. I'm still in the tribe. Don't hate me for being so fucked up I'm extraordinary.
Yeah. No, amen to all of that. I'm totally with you there. You know, this theme of being wild, I think I feel like it's more accepted for men to be wild. It's more encouraged and more like a kind of mysterious, interesting thing. Whereas for us, it's different. And Victoria, I loved your poems. I thought they were so wonderful. And just what you were saying about kind of embracing rage and anger, I'm all for that. And I feel like in my daily life, I always tell people, yes, embrace the anger, embrace the rage. But then actually thinking about it, I don't think I'm very good at that, even though I preach that myself. I think I'm pretty bad at like confrontation. I think I'm pretty bad at just dealing with things head on. And part of the reason, I think, going back to this like familial kind of lineage theme, is because I was taught not to do that growing up, because I was worried about being labelled like the angry woman of colour, which happens so much to so many people. And I think it was kind of drilled into me not to be difficult and not to be, you know, visibly angry and visibly embracing that rage as much as I want to do that. And I feel like that's never going to leave my brain as much as I wanted to.
We're all kinds of wrong because of history, because history has told us that, and we're now trying to undo all of that and re-love ourselves, all of our wrongs, because historically that's what we have been.
But and also the thing about when in the episode in Wild, I'm trying to remember who said it, but I think it was in the discussion group when someone talked about how wild for men is like an adventure, but wild for women is always about being hysterical or being slightly. And that really struck me when you were all talking. It was this idea about, you know, wildness is actually, for women, it's always, there's no room for it. There's no place for it. There's no, I wondered about what you might think about that.
I loved Victoria's anger and those poems. I was listening again on the train as I was coming in, and I was just kind of giving the face to everybody around me. It's like, but I was thinking as well about that idea of a thing that's being talked about more recently is kind of maternal rage. That postnatal depression is a nice sort of little box that just implies you're a wee bit sad. It's called the baby blues. And I got hit really badly with it twice, but it didn't come in the form of just being sad. It, both times full on anger and rage that I'd never had in those hormonal levels before, that I medicated myself out of immediately and felt ashamed of, rather than trying to work with in some way. I don't know if anybody, those sort of switches of emotion.
It's obviously not the same as your experience, but I find being a mother rage-inducing. See, if I'm honest, it's like, I love my son and I love being his mum, and he's so much in my life, but at the same time I'm like, no, I want to be able to go out and not have to think about when I come back. I want to put my phone off. I want to be a bad mum and not be judged for it. So see that maternal rage, the minute you said it, I was like, I feel it every day. Every day in the school run. But then obviously you've had that experience too, and you say, as you say, package it up, and it's like, you've got baby blues. It's a justified response to a life-altering role. And
we talk about it as if it's hormonal, but actually it may well be a healthy response to a situation that is ludicrous, because we are all living in individual. We should have more support than that. We should have school buses. Do you know what I mean? Why have we not got school buses? That's mental. And why are we all schlepping to school do you know what I mean? And it finishes at 3:30. That doesn't happen anywhere else in the world. That's crazy. But we individuate it, and then it's just your physicality is problematic. Yeah. But that individuation of rage, I think when you meet other women, but you have to sort of trawl through the playground to find the other really angry women. It takes about 10 or 15 other mums sometimes.
But it's so interesting about how much times we talk about like that we almost have to be broken, and we have to be, it's a mental health thing. And actually quite a lot of the times I've been thinking this a lot about the way in which we talk about as women get older, and the way we talk about menopause as well, that sometimes I think some of this rage is about becoming invisible, or the lack of opportunity, or the way in which, so some of it feels like actually maybe this is, we don't know how to be angry. We don't know how to be wild with our kind of, in that way, that we have to somehow, I've got a mental health, or it's...
Yeah. Rather than just the fact that having two small children who will not get out of the bath and will not put their clothes on and are asking you lots of random questions and running about is enraging. It is to have to deal with that non-stop all day, every day. And
yeah. It is enraging, and you're knackered. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I wonder what sort of, there's always this sort of aphorism, it takes a village, we've all become too atomised, I wonder, in the past, how did those mythical communities where children were reared in community, how did they just pass the kids on to another person at a time? Or?
So my mum was part of a very big family, and they all lived up and down this street in Rutherglen, and it was like all tenements, so they all had like single ends, and if a sister was overwhelmed with her children, she would drop them off at another sister's. And I think that worked really well to a certain extent, but then I think everybody kind of did quite well. Some of the aunties got to university as adults, and then they all ended up living in individual houses, and they just didn't have that kind of support anymore.
Bell Hooks talks a lot about that, actually. She talks about when she was growing up in an African American community. A lot of the mums were single mums, were all working mums, so she had loads of aunties that weren't her aunties, and exactly what you've just described. I'm going to work now, you need to... And she said that as a woman, she learned from her elders, she learned her own history, she made connections with other women, cross-generational connections. And as you've just said, the minute we move out of that, you're on your own. And we're encouraged to live in that box as a family. And maybe our understanding of family's wrong. Like you say, you're 15 sisters in a street is maybe a much more sensible way to rear children.
It's capitalism, isn't it? It's like, this will benefit you if you've got a bit of lawn. How? How is that? You haven't got anybody that can take your wains if you're late. How does that benefit anybody? Do you know what I mean?
This is also that interesting, that the way about patriarchy as well. It's about make women so completely, make child rearing so overwhelming, and so everything has to focus on them, and if you don't actually have room for yourself. Like if you're a good mother, there's no room for you, and there's something about
it's not overwhelming if you do it very badly.
Yeah,
trust me.
Kirstin, you wrote in our change episodes, you wrote the provocation piece, and I think you captured that really brilliantly, actually, that the contrast between dealing with the immediate rage that's right in front of you, and then also all the overwhelming information we have about other things that we ought to be angry about, and you called for us to find a way to not be saturated in outrage that's make us coagulate. If we pause to bear witness to everything, do we perhaps miss our moment to make change? That was your fantastic provocation.
And you articulated so beautifully that common feeling of being overwhelmed and paralysed by the world, and also about living within a small community. And I thought when listening that there was something, is there something in the community and local action which can be a way to escape that paralysis? And I wondered what you thought about that.
Yes, it's also exhausting because what Denise was saying, there's no anonymity. Everybody knows your business, and if they don't like what you have been doing, it will be spread all over the local Facebook page. There's a community project that both of us have been involved in as a sort of to get a community larder, and it's all about supermarket waste instead of a food bank, which was in Renfrew, which is quite far away from our village. This was a site in the village where anybody could come, no questions asked. The food is supermarket excess produce, so has to be used that day. And then there's become a whole situation where one of the local shopkeepers has launched this sort of militant mission. And all of this sounds like more tiny little details that is not within the scope, but actually that can be exhausting as well. I do miss the anonymity sometimes, the anonymity of campaigning on a broader level, I guess, yeah. But at the same time, within that community, I feel like I've found something that I hadn't had before and had been looking for in various places. So yeah, I was going to ask everybody else, just it's basically like, do you feel this too? But it's that idea of overwhelm and oversaturation within the internet, knowing that we need to do something, feeling miserable about the state of affairs. I don't think there's anybody who could open up whatever way they get their news in the morning, and I really should stop making that Twitter. It's a horrendous way to start your day. But I don't know, I mean, is there anybody who can wake up, take in what's happening in the world every morning and feel like there's a way of making a positive change? Have you got strategies around that for you and for the change that you want to make?
Honestly, no, I've not cracked it yet. I would really like somebody to tell me what the answer is. That idea of feeling overwhelmed and like paralysed by everything happening, I definitely feel that. And especially around like the pandemic, I took a break from social media in terms of just not scrolling through things, and that was really helpful. But I realised I replaced it with TikTok, and I replaced it with... But in my head, I think that's okay because it's just animal videos mostly on TikTok, and it feels more like safer. So that's one recommendation. Replace your scrolling on Instagram and Twitter or whatever with animal videos, and you'll feel so much better. But yeah, I don't know what the answer is to just getting over that feeling of being overwhelmed. But reading your provocation, listening to it, it did make me think, oh, maybe I should do more things on a much more local level in my neighbourhood, in my community, because I don't do any of that. Maybe that would make me feel like, I was getting involved and getting engaged in things, but in a way that isn't so overwhelming and so feels like it's out of my reach.
I think for me, so I have Instagram because I love pets, and I'm also a mad Celtic history and language buff. So I watch like kind of like Word of the Day and Irish and Manx and all that. So I've kept that, and I've kept Pinterest basically for similar hobbies that I don't have time for. But I don't have Twitter, and I don't have Facebook, and I don't read the news. And it's not that I'm not a political person. It's not that I'm not active. It's just that it was actually eating into any agency that I did have. And I started to think this is actually poisoning the well so much for me that I couldn't clearly see where I could make a difference. Maybe there's a bit of nihilism in that, maybe looking at things like climate justice and things like that and going, well, actually, I don't have a stake in this. It's so big. It might sound defeatist, but it's not if you can start from the bottom. And I think that social media is not useful to a protest movement, if I'm honest. I think that it identifies key movers in that to the state, which to me is just, that makes no sense. But also it's too open for nitpicking and kind of, so yeah, I would be like, if you want to clear your head of that, just do it.
And also the fact that people think of retweets activism as well. Like, I feel like they've done it. There's quite a lot of that, isn't there?
I think also after the Iraq war, going on that march and it making no difference, I just realised a lot of the stuff that we think is activism is actually just a way of keeping middle class people busy. Do you know what I mean? It's not really changing anything. This is just, we're all just getting together and, you know, saying to each other, we're brilliant, aren't we? You know, this isn't this brilliant? Do you know what I mean? And actually, are you going to make it? And that thing about being overwhelmed, I came off Twitter and I was freed up so much time. It's brilliant. And emotional energy. Do you know what I mean? Which, so it makes me think again about marching, that it wasn't really making any difference. That, I mean, I quite like Twitter, to be honest, because I muted almost everybody and it was all animal videos and funny jokes, because some of the jokes on that were absolutely brilliant. But I just thought, I'm going to end up basically at Elon Musk's work. I don't want, do you know what I mean? Do you know what I mean? And but that thing about being overwhelmed first thing in the morning, basically, I was looking after my mum for about 2.5 years during COVID because she was dying. And so what I would do was I would not check in with her for the first half hour after I woke up. I would go for a run, I would take the dog out, I would do something good for my mental health. And that's become a habit, and that's a great habit to get into. Think about things that you like in your life. Think about what you can do that's actually useful. You've only got 2 hands. Do you know what I mean? If you don't have a Learjet, you're probably not the problem in climate change, to be honest, right? Calm down about it. Do what you can in front of you. But I think there are a lot of things that are really paralysing the scope of things, the sense that you're not making any difference. But actually, what's important is we keep striving and we keep seeing those fake things that are not going to really make any difference to the world. But, you know, I think the striving is the thing that makes the difference, but we're probably all fucked. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely someone, I think that small changes. I like that idea about what you can see in front of you. And I think these things have, I mean, I do believe in that ripple effect.
That leads us nicely to talking about our success episode, actually, because in a big part of that episode, we were trying to redefine, rethink about what success means, trying to make it work for us in a different way and deconstruct it. And Arusa, you shared quite a tender and quite personal piece of writing about your journey from achieving and then losing your dream job, as many other people did during the pandemic. And you also talked about how the prompt from us to write about success made you instantly think of your failures, and you were questioning that. Do you think, are we at risk of kind of selling ourselves short a little bit if we do deconstruct success too much? If we redefine it, do we risk undervaluing ourselves actually, do you think?
I think yes, in a way. And since that event and since the podcast was recorded, I've been thinking a lot about how just generally as women we really do diminish success. We don't allow ourselves to be successful, or when, certainly in my case, like when something good happens, I don't shout about it as much as I maybe should because I feel like I'm annoying people. But why? You know, you should be happy with your successes, whereas when it comes to failure and when I fail at something, I feel like I'm more inclined to share that. Isn't that weird? And I don't know why that is.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and we notice it a lot. Like, it feels like you have to get out in front of it somehow, don't you? You have to kind of like, oh, I'm terrible at this, before someone else points it out to you somehow.
I just feel that pride comes before a fall is always in my head whenever I feel good about myself. I'm just wait.
Yeah, it is that like, oh no, what's going to happen now? This good thing's happened. What does that mean? And that's always been the case for me all my life. And I don't think any one person has made me feel like that. It's just the way it is. And I think a lot of women probably would agree that they feel the same way.
Absolutely. What's the question you brought for the gang?
Yeah, so I guess this question was more specific to recent times, but I wanted to ask everyone how their definition of success has changed since the start of COVID in particular, and if so, what has happened to foster that change?
It was a great break for me because I suddenly realised, because I was doing so much, and then I knew that it wasn't sustainable, and it made me really slow down, and it made me think, I'm 56. Do I really want to be going off for like 24 hours in Reims in France where no one really knows who I am and I don't really know why I'm there. And do you know what I mean? It really made me slow down, and it really made me think I want to be more present in my life and less trying to do things in case I miss out on. Do you know what I mean? Like, I feel less seen. I think a lot of us felt less seen. I don't know. Did you feel less seen?
Yeah, I think definitely agree with you in that I was reaching a point where I felt like everything was a bit too much, for sure. And there was that break, that sense of a break, and a feeling like you could kind of sit back and just reevaluate things. But I think just in terms of this like theme of success in particular, I think losing a job during that period was really weirdly beneficial for me to really start again almost, or really just stop and just be like, okay, you know, I'm not thinking about things like work the right way at all, because I feel like I made work like a kind of personality trait, and it was my entire life. And I feel like I've spoken to other people that have said the same thing, where before COVID, it is just a different way we've kind of viewed work. And I feel a lot more at peace with how I think about work now compared to before COVID, for sure.
It's funny that, isn't it? That I don't even know if it's a gender thing or a capitalism thing, but we see success only if we've completely martyred ourselves for it. Do you know, like to your apps. So almost like when this thing is taken away from you, from this thing that's just outside, you realise that I wasn't that successful at all. Not for me. I could really relate when you're saying I found it as a part of my identity and I wasn't viewing it right, and I had to put the brake on to see that. I don't know why that is, but I think we could probably in the room have all done
I
it.
lived in London in the 80s, and people would, if you said to them, when they introduced themselves, they would tell you what they did for a job. And in Glasgow, because when I moved here in 84, it was like unemployment was really, really bad. So people introduced themselves in different ways. So they would not tell you what they did for a living, or they would say, this is what I do for a living, but they wouldn't say, I am a lawyer. They would say, I work as a lawyer, or to trade, I'm a lawyer. Do you know what I mean? It was like a totally different way of identifying. I thought that was fantastic. And they would tell you what they were interested in as their identity, or they would tell you what activism they were involved in as their identity. Sometimes they would tell you about their religion as an identity. And I see us moving away from that as a measure of success. It's like you become subsumed by your professional position, you know?
I like that, and I think we should be moving away from that. I like the idea of, you know, introducing yourself but not talking about your work, saying, hi, I'm Arusa and I've got a cat. You know, that's how I want people to know me.
There's a different thing though. As a writer, it took me a long time to actually say I'm a writer. I still don't. Sometimes I just dodge I'm a really bad one for chatting to taxi drivers, and half the time if the conversation comes round to me, I just say, oh, I do such and such, or such and such, take a job from my past. But I don't do journalist either, because that's another kettle of fish that you don't want to open up with a taxi driver. And so I'll just like pick one of the jobs that I've done. I've done loads of them, and just concentrate on that a wee bit rather than say writer, because I'm embarrassed about it. I think I don't want to seem successful. This is a difficult question for me, because actually 2020 and 2021 were my most professionally successful years ever, and I had a book out that actually hit quite big, not financially successful, but professionally successful. So it's quite difficult in terms of, I've been reframing my life around, I need to create more writing time and also still have money coming in, and my children are older now, and against that sort of spending time at home, unable to move anywhere, just going for walks in nature, really simplified everything else down a bit, which is odd seeing as I was just banging on about overwhelm there.
So if you think, if that success had come at a time when it was more like normal in air quotes, and it was more now, do you think things would be very different for you? You'd feel differently?
I don't know if the book would have been as successful in a different time. I really, really benefited from everybody having more time to read just at the point that my book came out, and that I was able to do Zooms. I did like 80 Zoom book groups over a year. So I was kind of more visible and more accessible than I would be able to be in a traditional setting where I'd have to be travelling up and down the country, looking after childcare, leaving my kids, that sort of thing. And I waited for quite a while to see if I was going to be able to get away with not answering that question, because I'm embarrassed about it. There is a sort of instinct, and I think it's probably female and probably Scottish, to not want to shout about it as well. The other thing that I was thinking of when I was listening to yours, though, is for years I worked at the Arches, and that was founded by Andy Arnold. And when I started work there, he said, right, this place is about giving people the right to fail. You don't just spring fully formed into your amazing Oscar-winning movie or whatever. You've got to have a space where you can do absolute shite and work out what does work and what doesn't. And in order to make any sort of art, you need that. You can't have an automatically successful, amazing piece of work without failures, whether they're just happening in your own head as you're working out something, or, you know, learning from those failures in order to work out what works.
It feels like, because this kind of feels like we should lead on to the home question, because that was the other thing that happened through the pandemic, wasn't it? That we all were in our homes, and Kerry's provocation about, I love the idea about when you became home, like when she physically became home, but also the healing power in finding home and reclaiming home, and what home means. And I suppose the kind of what I was quite interested in posing to the group was the idea is, how is your relationship to home and the idea of home changed, you know, through your life, but maybe particularly we could relate that back to how that's changed through the pandemic as well. So I kind of offering that to you all to sort of think about.
I think it's been a bit of a difficult one for me, because during COVID I was shielding, so I was at home and not leaving the house for a very long time, and I did definitely lose my mind a little bit as the home became not a place of comfort necessarily. It became this kind of prison, basically, that I wasn't allowed to leave. And you know, I'm very fortunate that I do live with my partner and our cat, and I wasn't by myself, but it just felt like I was stuck. And even coming out of that, when you were allowed to do things again, and now that things are, you know, normal, as whatever normal is, I still view home sometimes in that kind of prison way, which is horrible, and I don't want to view it like that. And also, we're in a 1-bedroom flat, so I was working in the living room, in basically just working, sleeping, eating in the same place, and I don't think that's healthy. And actually, just recently I've got an office space, and it has changed my life, because I just now only now have started to view home as home again, and not home as somewhere that I work as well. And it's been so healthy for me to just have a space that I can have that separation.
I was part of an amazing project through Edinburgh Book Festival, the kind of Outriders thing. Myself and another poet, Kieran Hodgers, when we were to look at borders, and we decided to compare Poland and Ireland in terms of economic migration. So we went to Poland, and then we went to Ireland. He's from Drogheda. So we went to Belfast and then Drogheda, and then we went across to Achill and Mayo, where my family were originally from, although that didn't go entirely to plan, but I'll not bore you with that. And I was not prepared for, because I thought, you know, you just go to these places and you learn a wee bit, and it was actually, when you talk about home, it was like a encompassing experience. Like I remember we went hill walking up Slievemore on the island, and you know, there's a deserted village, a farming village, and then you go round the back and there's like all the kind of potato tracks that have been empty since the kind of Great Hunger, and I just felt this weird sensation and overwhelming loss, because that's why I'm in Glasgow in a kind of odd way, but also finally being all right. Just, you've got this answer, you've got, and it's not to say that Achill Island's my home, it's not, although I would love it to be. By the way, if anybody ever wants to give me a barn or something to write in for the winter. But it was just like, you realise actually, they say that like wherever home's where you hang your coat or whatever, it's not, it's where you actually feel whole. Do you know, and sometimes you need to reach out a wee bit. So maybe a wee bit when people talk about, oh, I felt lockdown was really oppressive because I couldn't leave. You couldn't branch the way you had to get your answers.
I think if you're from a diaspora, home is a yearning. It's not a certainty. And most of us are from a diaspora of some kind, you know. And, you know, it is about a place that you yearn to be. And with lockdown, I think what a lot of us experienced was the sense that awareness that home is something that you yearn for. It's a sense of belonging or a sense of absolute or certainty. And there isn't any certainty. And what's really uncomfortable is that's home. Home is uncertainty, and you have to just embrace that, and you have to say, I don't know what's going to happen in the future. I don't know if the roof is going to hold. I don't know if the neighbours are going to change. It's just this is the uncertainty, and you have to hold yourself in it. It's like being sad. The way to deal with being sad is just sit and be sad. And the way to deal with home is just to sit and be uncertain, I think, about where you are and just embrace that.
And this idea, I was thinking as well when you were talking about like the Industrial Revolution and about how cities offered women freedom. And it felt to me there was something in COVID where we were, I'd spent a long time being at home with the kids, and I'd finally got out in the world, and suddenly I was back at home. And I felt like a lot of women I knew felt like suddenly we were kind of returned to home, and we were overwhelmed with housework, and you were having meetings with women with kids where there would always be distract, like there would always be children running around behind, and they couldn't be fully. It felt like something had been taken away, or there was something again in our home. And it just struck me that when you were talking about the Industrial Revolution, there was, I don't know if that feels relevant to talk about, but that idea of home and what that means, that home is a place of work.
I really related to what you were saying about the idea of getting an office and getting like a space. I tried to take over a disused shop during the pandemic and make it into a community co-working space, but I'm terrible at running a business. I have no head for it whatsoever. And then, just because I needed a space that was not my home in order to be a writer. I can't write. There's mess everywhere. There's toys everywhere. There's half-eaten bits of toast. And, I can't do that in home. I need to separate myself out and go somewhere else, even if it's a cafe with really loud music blaring in my earphones. I was thinking about the idea of the diaspora, though, because my first job when I was 16, I was a chambermaid in an Edinburgh guest house that only placed one advert a year, and it was in the Mackenzie clan diaspora, whatever they had, like news sheet or whatever. So it targeted itself almost exclusively at Mackenzie Americans who were coming back to trace their Mackenzie heritage. And we had to wear Mackenzie tartan scrunchies and Mackenzie tartan waistcoats, and all the carpets were Mackenzie tartan as well. And if anybody asked, we had to say we were of the Mackenzie clan. And it was so weird. I would have these conversations every morning with these Americans who thought that they had come home. Now, even though it was this completely manufactured place, they all used that word home, visiting the old country, coming home, and that kind of idea of this sort of home as a place. It was weird to me because I haven't got any sort of sense of that. My dad's family are actually Irish Catholics who settled in Scotland, but they're not in my life at all. And my mum's family are very atrophied and don't really keep in touch. So I grew up without that big family thing. So it was strange to me to have these people coming over with this idea of their own heritage in their heads that they could recreate, and using that word home for it as well.
What does it mean? It's so funny, isn't it? The belonging, and it's not an identity, and it is a physical place we're all looking for.
Yeah, I mean, for me, if I'm really honest about it, it was probably about looking for that belonging in the wrong places. To go back to what we were talking about earlier, I probably feel like I don't belong. It's not really because of my Irish heritage. I'm Glaswegian, we all have that. It's not that. It's not the thing that sets me apart. But maybe I was looking for... I'd been working with the Galgale Trust for a while before we went, and a lot of their work is kind of about generational trauma in Glasgow. They kind of link it to the Highland clearances and kind of not being connected with the land. And then I started to think, well, maybe that is part of it. But I think the truth is maybe it was just trying to fill a hole that was possibly caused during COVID, for all the plates dropping, and I'd been working so hard I didn't know who I was anymore. And I thought, well, I'm going to Mayo to find out. And I kind of did, but I didn't find what I thought I was going to find because, like you say, it's not a real place.
But it's such a lovely urge. It's such a beautiful urge to find a place that's safe and certain. That's a beautiful thing to want.
I find this is all really interesting because, especially what you're saying about trying to like find somewhere, because I've been thinking about this a lot recently. I think going back to that Kirstin story as well about working in the Mackenzie, trying to be a Mackenzie or whatever it was. Yeah, I've never been to India, but my dad was born there, and he's been quite sick recently, and especially over kind of COVID, that idea of yearning that you were saying, Denise, I felt that, but I wasn't really ever sure why I felt that. But I think it's because he has been sick, and I've never been to his home, which is, you know, my technically motherland, my home. I feel like a lot of regret that I haven't done that, and there is a sense of yearning because it's a sense of wanting to connect with my family and my dad, and I don't know if that'll ever really go away. And I wonder if that happens at a certain age. You know, for example, if your parents are from somewhere else and they are getting older, if that happens at a point where you think, oh, I really regret not, I don't know, travelling or seeing what it was like when they were growing up.
But in America, they have a much better attitude to that kind of identity. You know, Greek American. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Like, you know, they have this kind of recognition that there are a multiplicity of identities. But for some reason within Europe, we have this thing of you have to choose the country and you're only allowed one identity, which isn't true of any of us. Yeah. We all inhabit a multiplicity of identities, and we all, you know, bring those things. Do you know what I mean? And the idea that it could be monolithic or it needs to be monolithic.
And I think, I think this going back to the idea of home, what's this idea that we create home. And I think when Kerry's piece was that longing for home, a lot of what she was talking about was a yearning for home and spending her life yearning for home. And then when she physically became home, when she became pregnant and then making a home as a mother, there was something in there that felt healing, I think, when I was listening to it. And that resonated with me, the idea that actually, when you start to make a home or you become home for someone else, that some of that yearning, some of it seems to sort of dissipate. And I wondered in the pandemic, because we were so kind of at home, and though that was stressful and we were doing the work and everything else, there was something about having control, and I definitely felt less yearning for finding something and trying to belong somewhere, because I could create my own belonging, you know, by my own four walls. So I did think that, yeah, Kerry really touches on that idea, and it's such an incredible piece of writing that she did for that. It feels like we've come to the end, and I'm going to pass on to Caitlin to kind of close us out, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I love what you've said there, Denise, about that longing being a beautiful feeling and searching for a place to belong. Maybe that is some sort of lifelong journey. And I mean, just personally, I guess, doing this podcast and connecting with the great artists that we have, the things that people have said, everything that you've all shared, I guess has been a big part of my own sense of finding belonging, finding my people and understanding myself and ourselves. So thank you all so much for being here today and for starting off 2023 with a great discussion. I hope you have loads more. Quines Cast will be back later in the year with season 2. Please look out for that. And in the meantime, thank you for listening and take care.
Yeah, take care of yourselves.
This episode of Quines Cast is created and presented by Hannah Lavery and Caitlin Skinner, featuring discussion with Denise Mina, Victoria McNulty, Kirstin Ennis and Arusa Qureshi.
Editor Helena Rafai, project producer Barbara Lyon, recorded at Podcast Studio Glasgow.
Quines Cast image by Julia Francis Dugan. Quines Cast is possible because of funding from Creative Scotland and support from our partners, the Travers Theatre, Edinburgh International Book Festival and Jupiter Rising at Jupiter Artland.
The Stella Quines team are General Manager Barbie Lyon, Associate Director of Engagement Beth Godfrey, Artistic Director and CEO Caitlin Skinner, Company Administrator and Young Quines Producer Erin McGee, Head of Audiences and Communications Sarah Marie Mooney.
If you want to keep up to date with all things Quines, please visit our website and sign up for the newsletter. We are Stellar Quines because of the many people who've supported us over the years. This year will see us reach our 30th year of asking for better representation and equality, and we still have a long way to go. We need your support and sponsorship to help us keep that work going. Please get in touch via stellarquines.co.uk if you can help support our future.